You're tuned in to the Stingbat Radio Network on FM 101.2 KRPG.
Welcome to Dungeon Master Diaries, a podcast about Shadow Dark and other role-playing games where two GMs talk about the recent experiences at the table and hopefully give you something useful that you can take to yours. On the show today, we discuss The Fighter. Hello there, sages and adventurers. My name's Jody, and with me, as always, my good friend and GM colleague, Matt. How are you? You recovered? You with us? You in it for the fight?
Oh, man, I am here. Well, speaking of fights, just fought off an unconscionably bad flu, and I am here, and I'm ready to talk about Shadow Dark. It has been responsible for canceling sessions, Jody, and nothing gets me more frustrated and upset than the canceling of a role-playing game session. But we're here to talk about recent experiences nonetheless. So,
yep, two of them fell victim to the plague-ridden blade, as it were. So today's episode, though, we're going to focus on the fighter class. In a past episode, we talked about thieves. We'll have to come back to them. They've been debated for, ever. Hopefully fighters, though, a little easier to access. Matt, take us to the table. Give us some context here.
All right, so Jody, I do want to talk about some recent experiences with the fighter. We'll get into those in a little bit, but I kind of want to give you a context and give the listeners a context of the fighter in general, because historically they have, and I guess not even historically, but even in contemporary games, they are seen as just being kind of boring, and it takes a lot to woo players over to the side of playing a fighter. And you got to answer the question, why would you play this class over something that has more spice to it? And so what I wanted to kind of focus on here is the fact that the original thing that seemed to get people in the mood to play a fighter was what we now refer to as the spiteful fighter in our open table games, right? This is where someone would roll up a thief or a priest or a wizard, and they would be excited to play, and then they would get hit by a goblin arrow, and they would die, and then they would roll up a fighter to come in to take over in their stead. And this was I think the thing that opened people's eyes to what fighters could be. And the thing that we have seen at the table time and time again is people realizing, oh my gosh, these fighters scale like crazy. They are single target damage dealing menaces. And especially if you pair them with parties that are complementary and can fill those voids, the fighter can be a combat in particular menace. But I think we'll get into some other things as well that we have seen fighters do that are not just combat specific. So I'm going to leave it a little vague here at the beginning, but that's a little bit from the table is this arc of people realizing, hey, these fighters, they're pretty strong.
All right, those fighters, they're strong, he says. So let's gather around the fire and talk about their strength, their acumen, and their skills, what they do well. And maybe, if I can hold on to this thought for more than a hamster's heartbeat, maybe as a GM, how do you get at them? Because there's some interesting stuff there I'd like to talk about too. You were talking about them right off the top, and I kind of want to start about the historically boring. I've been listening to Dungeon Crawler Carl as I do some hobby work lately, and one of the character classes is literally called a boring old fighter. So what makes them dull, Matt? Let's just start with that. Why don't people want to play fighters? They fight. That's cool, right?
100%. But I think, when you look at the spell lists associated with priests and wizards, and you look at, I think it's easier to imagine the fantasy of even a thief crawling around in the dark and picking locks and things. And I think that when you look at the fighter as a class in a lot of games, what you notice is a pretty one-dimensional problem that you have to solve for, right? That on your turn in combat, 9 times out of 10, if we're talking about the generic kind of, I think even the cliche and stereotypical fighter, it's roll a d20, add a number, see if you hit, maybe roll damage if you hit. And then from there you move on. And so I think there are lots of games that have tried to solve for this. Obviously, D&D 5th edition attempted to do this by, having subclasses that were diversified and things. And then what I really want to talk about is Dungeon Crawl Classics and the way that they solve for this problem. But we can get there in a second. But that's really the core issue is roll D20. It's your turn, fighter. What do? I roll D20, I add number, and I say, did I hit? And that's about, I think, what people who understand the mechanics of D&D are coming to the table with. And I think you couple that with the fact that people who are new to the game might be coming in and have a specific fighter in their head and then maybe not be able to see that represented in the rules in terms of the fantasy versus the mechanics. I don't know if that last one's a little wishy-washy, but
no, I actually want to talk about that a second because I feel that the fighter suffers from the problem of a lack of archetypes or reference points, actually.
Oh, that's interesting.
That a thief, there's a narrative that pops into head very quickly of, am I a schmoozer and a talker? Am I a lurker in the shadows? How am I doing my nefarious thievery? If I'm a wizard, am I a Gandalf or am I a Merlin or am I a card trickster who can actually do some magic? Or if I'm a priest, there's all these images that come to mind very quickly and comic book characters that jump to mind and oh, they're like this. You and I have been talking about barbarians a bunch and that it's kind of funny that when you say barbarian, most people go to one barbarian very quickly. It's Conan. And you're like, oh, it's Conan the Barbarian. Great. And when we were talking about bards, we were also surprised at how diverse those archetypes are. The fighter archetype is kind of faceless. We can all picture a fighter in our mind very quickly.
Yeah.
But it's not, it's very vanilla. It's very just general. So what's the spice of that story? And then, mechanically, if I'm a thief, I get to swing a sword and do damage. If I'm a wizard, I can swing a stick and do damage. If I'm a priest, I can swing a long sword and do some pretty serious, so what else do I get? And I think that what else do I get is huge as well.
I want to stay on this topic for just 1 second because I want to ask you, I think, and you can tell me if you think I'm wrong, I think when people think about a fighter, what they think about is specifically a knight. I think that's the touchstone. And then that is people are quickly told, well, you can't afford plate mail, and the things that a knight would do are not the things that the fighter class would do. I don't know. Does that ring true for you?
No. But the reason it doesn't ring true to me, I think 6-year-old me, yes.
Okay.
But I saw D&D artwork so early that the notion of a fighter is the guy with a helmet and chainmail and a shield going into the ground and some loose armor and gear, and that's the fighter guy. It's even there. It's this generic imagery. The inside of Keep on the Borderlands, there's a piece of art of a few fighters facing off against an owlbear, and it's a cool piece. It's
one of the only pieces of art in the entire module, Jody.
Well, it's
I know
a good
that
reference point
because I've been mining that damn module for art a couple of times, and then realized there's only 3 or 4 pieces of art in there.
Yeah, there's a couple bangers, two different versions of a Minotaur, and then that. Yeah, there's not
adventures.
There's not a ton of other great stuff in there. Cool silhouette of some people walking up to a keep on the Borderlands, but that image, that's foundational for me, and in part of my coming to. It's not Aragorn because he's a ranger. So Boromir, the guy who dies.
Well, here's okay.
And I think if you're not coming from those traditions, absolutely, I think the knight's just as valid. And yeah, there is the threshold problem of I'm going to be a knight. Okay, how about a squire? Which I think is actually one of the titles, right?
Well, okay. So I want to talk about this. I want to go to the Aragorn thing. You bring this up. I don't know if this was if you were trying to get a rise out of me, but Aragorn being a ranger is the most cliche thing.
Yeah.
Right. I feel like you could do basically everything you need to do to make Aragorn work in Shadowdark with the fighter, because Aragorn is not looking for herbal remedies, is he?
Yeah, he does. It's a huge scene. In fact, he saves Frodo's life.
Oh, that's right. He does. Damn it.
That's where that comes from.
I'm trying to think
and
of
he's homies with the elves, and he can speak Elven.
Okay.
And he wears and he kind of dabbles with their magical nonsense in a way that other people can't. And he's like 200 years old.
Well, isn't he a half elf?
Not a. You really want to go down the lore hole for Tolkien?
I asked that question specifically to annoy Tolkien heads.
Yep.
So let's move on.
Yep. That's it. That's what he is. That's the answer.
Okay, let's move on. But what I find is, okay, so the first question was actually in earnest, and then I completely forgot about that very important scene. But what I'm getting at is, there's a ranger background in Shadowdark. Right. There's actually a ranger background for the fighter. And I think that there's also an herbalist background.
And you can be a dex fighter in Shadowdark.
And you can be a dex fighter. And I think that one of the things I like about the fighter is that you can actually bring the fantasy to the Shadowdark fighter. And you can see it lived out. You might not be able to roll it up randomly, right? You might have to choose your background in this case. But I think you can do a lot worse than the framework. And so that's what I've seen at the table is, we've seen barbarian type characters. One of our Sunday group players consistently has this kind of meathead kind of, I want to kick down the door and break people's kneecaps.
Yeah. Apt.
It's specifically the character, his name is Broke Knee. So, I mean, there it is.
Yeah. He's a real chew on your ankles kind of guy. And I think that point's so important that maybe of all the classes, if you step into a fighter, you get to do the deciding of who is this person, or take my favorite approach, despite how things have gone for me lately as a player, of let the character kind of reveal themselves as I play them. And fighters excel at that because if I can, I want to kind of push us forward to the spiteful fighter, as we've started calling it, of like my cool casty whatever person died, and like in spite I'm gonna roll up a fighter because doggone it. The answer of why is because I want some hit points and some armor so I can stick around. Dang it.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of other stuff the fighter does pretty well in Shadowdark. I mean, enough so that when we interviewed Kelsey, you called it out as, the master of the core 4.
Fighters are fun to play, man.
Fighters are fun to play. They do a lot of stuff well. So let's get into the spiteful fighter who does some stuff real well.
Right. So this is what people find out is they look and they see the 1d8 hit points and they think, now we're talking.
D4, get out of here.
Yeah, it's surprising to me how few dwarven fighters we have, but that's a conversation for another day. So first of all, I mean, just starting from the top, right, there's the actual description, bloodsoaked gladiators, et cetera, et cetera. So the thing that, sort of sets up the class is this short little kind of evocative statement of what the class can encompass. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about bards, is that you want this to frame the class such that when the player chooses it, they have some kind of imagery in their head. This is probably the most wide-ranging, and is it helpful? Yes. Does it do what a definition is supposed to do, which is sort of include only the things that should be included and exclude them? I'm not sure, because it basically says if you would like to use any weapon and fight monsters, this is the class for you, which we will find out it is. But I just wanted to kind of start there. The fact that you can use all weapons and all armor and shields, again, doesn't really make any sense until you've had those limitations placed on you. And I think that's like one of those things that the spiteful fighter comes from is, wait a minute, if I choose this class, I can just carry around a huge beat stick and have a shield and just wail on people and probably not die. Hell yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, I'm here for that. I'm going to back up a second to the description, and then I want to move forward with this notion of wearing whatever weapon and armor combo you want. It's interesting that the fighter description at the end of it calls out far-eyed elven archers. See earlier Tolkien comments a few moments ago, which character that is we're talking about. It's not Aragorn. It's not Boromir. It's Legolas. It's this name. But then you go, but all weapons, longbow, I get to truck out this huge amount of damage because comparatively it is. All armor and shields, hey, if you're a starting character, you're poor. Leather armor and a shield feels pretty good. But that again, that notion of that flexibility, and as you let us off with the D8 hit points, durability. I'm going to stick around and I can be whatever I want. But yeah, you're still not getting any direction here.
No. And then of course the hit points are alluring, right? The 1d8 hit points per level is very alluring. And that, I think, if you look at the fighter just as a new player without having actually rolled up a character, you're new to Shadowdark, what you're going to see is you're going to see the hit points, more hit points, or a larger hit point potential than any other class at first level for sure. You're going to see the all weapons, all armor, all shields, great, whatever. And then if you start looking at the abilities, I personally think you're going to have the same reaction to the Shadowdark fighter as you might others, because inside of Hauler, Weapon Mastery, and Grit are contained very complex applications in some cases, right? And also an incredibly large amount of scaling. But that's just not like, I don't think that you're going to see that until you play. And again, hence people roll dice, they play through their character dies, and suddenly a lot of the stuff on the fighter class page jumps off the page and you go, oh, aha, now I understand why it's useful to add my Constitution modifier to my gear slots. Got it.
Yeah, and wait, I can just kind of focus on these 3 stats instead of all 6 stats. If my strength is good, that's good. If my dex is good, that's good. If my constitution's good, that's good. And if I was the thief a few moments ago who fell in a pit trap and that was it, oh man, the caltrops, the rope, the grappling hook, the leather armor, the dagger, the short bow, the arrows, and I'm almost out of slots. Rations notwithstanding, and like I'm that rattling off and keeping my track on my fingers because I can do that kind of math. That's 8 out of 10. And hey, Hauler, and it's become ubiquitous for us in Dungeon Delves that people go, oh, we found this stuff, and then looks at the fighter and goes, how many slots do you have?
Yeah.
Oh, we have a fallen comrade. How many slots do you have open, fighter? Like, it's just automatic. People start looking there, which is a fun piece of that narrative as well. Think if you're playing a lot of Shadowdark and you are GMing and you are not creating situations where that question's coming up, I encourage you to start pushing that direction of the question of, do we have enough gear slots to do what we need to do? I, both as a player and a GM, really love that little bit of bookkeeping that comes up and lets the fighters do this unique thing where they're like, oh, I've got slots, I'm okay.
Yeah.
And then the wizards usually also go, oh, I'm good, I have slots. And everybody kind of gives a sideways glance of, I don't think we want to give the giant treasure to you, 6 hit point person. If we're lucky, you have 6 hit points, So I don't know. Actually, of those 3, because let's get into all of them.
Yeah.
Hauler might be my favorite in terms of like flavor.
Well, I think this is a really important thing to take note of, is that and I am guilty of doing this even pretty recently, everything needs to take a slot. In even if it's a ring, which sometimes seems so stupid, I think it's still important that even rings and jewelry and things that you could quote unquote wear take a slot. And that is something I've realized through our time with Shadowdark, is just how important the slot economy is. Not even, and you can see it from the get-go. It's very clear on the character sheet. It's very clear in the rules. I don't think it's really clear until you start playing how core it is to creating pressure and leverage. And once you start allowing certain items to be free to carry, you actually start like taking your foot off the gas a little bit on that, and you actually end up making fighters less interesting because you undermine that Hauler ability.
Yeah, and I think that idea of pressure and taking your foot off the gas is so true. And I think both of us had an alignment here of initially, if somebody was like, well, it's a magic ring, can I just wear it and make it free to carry? Sure, yeah, that makes good sense. I mean, it's not really, but my counter argument, if you are thinking along those lines, is you're wearing your armor and that takes slots. It's just fundamental. And yeah, it makes the fighters do something cool, especially in a moment when we get to Grit, the aspect of, are they a strength-based fighter versus a dex-based fighter, which has some really interesting nuances. But before let's do what is, I think, the the best sales pitch of being a fighter is weapon mastery. Like if you want to
Sure.
sell somebody on being a fighter, this is the one. So I'm going to read it and then go ahead and react away.
Sure.
All right. So as a fighter, you're going to choose one type of weapon, such as a longsword. You gain +1 to attack and damage with that weapon type. In addition, add half your level to these rolls round down. What we're finding is once you start creeping up the levels, it's pretty good. It's pretty good.
Yeah, so it uses the standard Shadowdark scaling methodology, which is, 1 plus half your level rounded down. We also see this in the Thief's backstab, adding 1 plus half your level rounded down of dice. So this is kind of a consistent thing across lots of different Shadowdark classes, both in the core book and in the Cursed Scrolls. And other folks have adopted it, and I think it's a really good kind of core element to work into homebrew classes. But weapon mastery in particular, I want to kind of get into the nitty-gritty here, because we can only talk about how great the scaling is for so long. The scaling is amazing. It keeps fighters relevant in terms of damage dealing, especially since the math is so flat in Shadowdark. However, I want to talk about some of the assumptions that I made and try and talk through whether or not those assumptions stand up to pretty rigorous, consistent play with the system. So the first one is, I don't like abilities that require you from first level to make a decision that is going to affect your character for the entirety of the time you play that character. For instance, we have a character in our Shadowdark game that has been around since the beginning, the last character that survived from session 1. We are on session 36 now. And I don't actually know what their weapon mastery is in. And I can see a player being somewhat or feeling somewhat hamstrung by that initial choice.
Yeah, once you're up around level 6, 7, 8, sure.
Right? Especially if you're using kind of, bespoke modules or rolling on treasure tables or whatever, and that kind of weapon isn't showing up as far as magical weapons are concerned. So I just kind of want to, I don't know, that's when you read it to me, after the scaling, that's what hits my ear.
Yeah, there's we've both experienced this, an interesting dynamic, because the fighter has access to all weapons and armor. And then you look at the weapon list, and there are clearly some weapons that are a little better than others. Given the choice between a long sword and a short sword, I will take the long sword. Thank you very much.
There's almost no mechanical difference between the two in terms of how they can both be used with one hand.
Yep.
The longsword is just purely better.
Right. And not everybody can use it. So if I'm a fighter, I'm taking that. Okay. And that's the example given in the book. Now, if I'm GMing, and I think this is what you and I realized in a shared campaign space where we have characters bouncing between the two of us as GMs, it's a double-sided whammy almost as a GM of your hands get tied a little. Of either I'm just purely randomly rolling my treasure tables, as is indicated by Shadowdark, that it feels like that's the direction I should be going, and I never ever give my fighter a magical longsword. It just never shows up.
Yeah.
So they never get to have the aha combo of magic weapons stacked with weapon master ability. Holy cow, I'm plus something insane. But the opposite side of that's also a problem. I go, hey, I have this person who's been great. They're doing an awesome job. They're really being the fighter that they can be. And now I give them I'm going to keep it really just flat and go, here's a +2 longsword. Well, now that just flat stacks that damage and the flat math, and they are really potentially out of power scale. And that's not even getting into it does an extra magical effect or that can really explode very quickly of additional damage dice or something. And now I've got this person who is tied to this one weapon forever. And so the fighter also narratively is only ever going to want to use this one weapon. And no matter what fight they're in, they're always going to take the exact same approach because there's a best option now. And we've taken a ton of options off the table.
Yeah, it's a super interesting problem because giving the fighter the weapon that they want actually creates less interesting choice for the fighter.
Right.
And I, again, this is something that I will cop to very, very, very readily, is that I didn't see this, right? I saw this as something that would hamstring players and make them feel like I don't want to choose the quote unquote wrong thing at first level. But what you realize is that because the scaling is so good and because the math is so flat, it's correct that if you have a mundane, let's say you took weapon mastery and longsword, and you have a mundane longsword, and then you find a +2 short sword, right? Now you have an interesting conundrum. If you're level 4, you're getting, +3 to your attack and damage rolls on top of your strength, or in this case, strength modifier, right? Which could mean that you're adding 5 or 6 to your attack rolls and then 3 to your damage rolls. I mean, we're talking like big numbers in terms of Shadowdark. And then you go over and you look at the short sword, and that's realize
+2, which is a dope magic weapon.
And what you realize is, and what I didn't realize, is that you're going to take a slight decrease in attack and damage. But what you gain in a magic item is the ability to hit creatures that cannot be harmed by only mundane, or that cannot be harmed by mundane items and can only be harmed by magic. And now you have an arsenal. There is a certain amount of truth to the fantasy of the fighter being, I mean, the way that it gets described pejoratively is like the golf bag.
Yeah.
But there is a certain amount of fantasy of the fighter using weapons that they find, right? That you see this all the time in like movies where fighters will improvise, or they'll take a weapon off of one of their foes and they'll start to use that. And I actually think that my initial interpretation of this was wrong. And I think that the scaling is good enough with your mundane weapon that, if you don't ever find another mundane weapon for your weapon mastery, that's bad, right? Like you should be able to replace it if you lose it or it gets, whatever. However, you shouldn't feel as a GM like it's necessary to quote unquote give your fighter access to a magic weapon of their weapon mastery. If it happens, holy crap, it's going to be awesome for the fighter, but it should happen organically. And I don't think that I really didn't feel that way when we first started playing.
Yeah, it's an interesting, and I think we haven't talked about this a ton on the show, of the flat math of Shadowdark, that a +1 or 2 matters, which is mechanically something I love about the system. In this one, and there's a few other spots, but in this one spot, you have to be very careful with it. And I think that the comedic golf bag, which in part of that though historically comes from games where tracking encumbrance was difficult, which is why I see earlier comment about the hauler abilities dope.
It's like, I have this lance that I totally forgot about. That's right. Like just
or a 10-foot pole. Oh, wait. You got me there again. Damn it. Yeah. So the weapon mastery is, you might say, a double-edged sword.
Jody, I do have a sad trombone. I'm going to not play it because I'm a better man than that.
So grit's an ability they have also.
Speaking of gritting, I was gritting my teeth through that bad pun.
There it is. We got there. We've moved on. So grit allows you to choose strength or dexterity. Again, a choice right off the top you're going to have to make. And you have advantage on checks of that type to overcome an opposing force, such as kicking open a stuck door, strength, or slipping free of rusty chains, dexterity. Okay, most classes have their thing that they get to roll with advantage. Here are the things you're really good at, roll with advantage. And this is where early on I kept pushing the conversation, like, or maybe you're a dex fighter. This locks it in. You are either Boromir, I'm going to just stick with the Tolkien references, or Gimli, and you're just pounding on things. Or are you Legolas, and you're nimbly bimbly and you surf on shields?
Yeah, not a fan of that.
Not a great scene. So the grit ability, now this is classic Shadowdark to me because you have advantage on checks of that type to overcome an opposing force. How do you rule opposing force?
Very broadly.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, so again, this is another place where, much like Hauler, depending on how you're running the game, you can potentially make the fighter worse than I personally, in my opinion, think that they should be, right? I try and reward and I try and encourage the use of grit as much as possible because, and I love you actually said this, and this, I'm going to give this to you. You described this perfectly as give advantage anytime you'd make a check where you might grit your teeth.
Oh, that was a good thing. I don't remember saying it, but I'll take credit. But
now,
sure.
if you didn't say that, then I'm
well,
sorry.
You know
for
what?
the
I just made you
apocryphal
grit your teeth poorly a moment ago, so I'll take a positive teeth gritting. I actually like that. I don't remember it, but I say a lot of things, thus being on this microphone and people being willing to listen, ? So, I think that works. And I think you and I, this is a point where we're definitely of the same mind of, unlike weapon mastery, where we both are now of the mind of be careful about what you're giving the fighter and don't just gild the lily of here's extra cool weapon that you're already great with. In contrast, when you're talking about grit, no, find excuses for the giant reaches down and grabs a hold of the fighter. I don't care if they're a dex fighter or a strength fighter. They wriggle that roll to wriggle free out of the giant meat fist is dope. That's a cool moment, and give them their advantaged roll. I did because I tend to initially brace towards over critical rulings. I'm a mean GM at first, and then I have to talk myself back. And so when I first read this, I read opposing force, and I was like, oh yeah, the giant reaches down and grabs you, and that's it. And then looked at the examples. I'm like, slipping free of rusty chains. The chains aren't opposing you. They're just there. And I had to go, yeah, but that's also not fun, dude. Don't tell the player, no, you can't use your ability. Let them have it's a dex check. Let them have their dex check. Like, crying out loud, just have fun. So that's me, and that's all own mine. Of my first impulse was to be like, no, there has to be actually something fighting against you or active. And I was like, I actually genuinely do wish the opposing force phrase was just not in grit. And that's basically how I run it is, are you needing to make a strength or dex check? Sure. Yeah. Is it a fightery kind of thing you're doing? Yes.
You have advantage on checks for fightery things.
Yeah. Well, hey, the thief has advantage on thiefy stuff. It's just spelled out. Yeah. So, and I mean, because I'm trying to make a dex check to pick this guy's pocket, I get advantage because I have grit, right? No, you don't, because that's not your ballywick. That's not a fighter thing to do.
Right.
And anymore, I'll be honest, when I think of the classes, all of them, even the expanded classes we use, that's my metric is this a insert title of class thing to be doing? And are you using your core statistic, your prime requisite, to use the old school title of it?
Hey, there
in this case, fighters get to pick their prime requisite, which is dope. Are you a dex fighter or a strength fighter? You choose. What kind of fighter do you want to be? And I actually like that this is a choice from jump. I like that this is no, pick it, and then you're committing to that bit, because it does finally give where we started at the top of like, man, we've got an Elven Ranger surfing on shields, and we've got Russell Crowe playing Gladiator, and somewhere in between those we got fighters. This one says, okay, let's make an early choice. Let's choose dex or strength. You nimbly bimbly, or you a meat boy? What you gonna do? Let's get there.
Yeah. I know which side of that I fall on for sure. But I want to talk very briefly about Dungeon Crawl Classics.
Yeah.
Because I think grit gets at something and should kind of inspire in players the feats of strength and the feats of dexterity that one might associate with some of these, in our case, kind of archetypal theatrical fighters. What Dungeon Crawl Classics does, and I believe you can have access to this in the free kind of Dungeon Crawl Classics. I don't know what they call it, but the player guide or whatever. So
quick start rules.
Thank you. The quick start rules for DCC, which, much like Shadow Dark, offer you an opportunity to play right off the bat, and that is awesome. But I digress. They have this thing in their warrior class called the Deed Die, or Mighty Deeds of Arms, that allow you to perform every single attack. You have the potential to do some deed. And some examples of these mighty deeds are things like when fighting opponents on a staircase, the character used a sword to stab an opponent and then lever him over the edge of the staircase. And then later, the same character tried attacking the foe's legs to knock him over the edge. That is something that I think is not necessarily contained within the mechanics of the fighter. And this is the only thing about the Shadowdark fighter that I think is a little bit, it's difficult for me to adjudicate at the table, because I don't know whether or not I should give advantage for something like, I want to try and stab this guy and then throw him over the edge, or like lever him and throw him over the edge, like this example. In Dungeon Crawl Classics, in DCC, they have a mechanic for this, and it gives a near binary answer of yes, you were able to do it, or no, you weren't. In Shadowdark, we have these two separate things. We have the attack roll and we have the damage roll, and that's contained within Weapon Mastery. And then we have grit, which is sort of, I can't tell if it's like an in combat or out of combat situation. I know that that's not necessarily the case. Like I have many times adjudicated grit rolls in combat, but I wanted to kind of get a sense of, if a fighter wanted to do something very fightery. Let's use the example from Dungeon Crawl Classics. You're fighting on a staircase, and they want to use their sword to stab an opponent and then throw them over the edge. How are you ruling that at the table? How are you going to make that a potential reality for the player?
Yeah, this is the kind of age-old debate over combat maneuvers.
Yeah.
And the problem at a 10,000 foot level, to get general with it, because that's how my brain always works, is, are we doing simulation or not, right? Are we doing simulation, or are we quick play mechanics? What are we looking for here? And Shadowdark clearly has stuck its flag in the quick resolution world, and we're not doing simulation. But the moment of, I want to toss this dude off the stairwell, is rad. And that's a thing a person could try to do. And Shadowdark is also very big on, let people try to do the cool heroic thing. That's part of its core ethos. So how do I rule it to get down to nitty gritty? This, I'm going to say at its top level, is something I have learned over the years of playing with you, of I'm going to approach this from my GM seat as a negotiation with the player. That's tier one, is I'm going to propose something, and I'll give them a pitch, say, hey, what about it works like this? Does that sound reasonable? Like, are you sure that sounds okay? Okay, now let's roll some dice. That's going to be the general framework I use, because I don't have a hard and fast rule. I really like something you've adopted, which is the +3 -3, which comes off of the core difficulty levels, right? You got easy, normal, hard, extreme checks. They're each spaced out by 3, up or down by 3. Give the guy extra 3 armor. I like that. I think it is, for me, it's a risk versus reward scenario. So in the specific example of you're fighting on a stairwell and I want to cast the guy off of the stairwell. In this moment, I'm going, okay, well, your wants to just pitch them to the bottom, right? Yes. Okay. How about you're going to make your attack, or we could do an opposed attack roll. And if you win, you're going to cast them down. You won't do damage, but the fall will, and they'll be down there. How does that sound? Yeah, I'm into that. Or that's not really what I was thinking. Cool. Then what were you thinking? And let's go that route.
Sure.
So that, I think in that case, my gut says I would probably call for some sort of opposed check, and then would give them grit. If they're like, I want to just like muscle them off the stairs. Hell yeah. That's going to be a grit check. They're going to make a strength check. And if you beat them, you're not going to damage them. You might use your sword to be involved, but it's the fall that's going to hurt them. Cool. Yeah. Click, go the dice, and the situation's resolved. That's kind of how I go. But the problem with that being advice is I like that mechanical, this time the dice are going to work like this to tell us something. This time the dice, I could change my mind.
You can't do that every time.
Right. And not all GMs like doing that.
Yeah.
And some players don't like doing that. Like, don't like being put on the spot of like, they don't feel comfortable if the GM's saying, hey, are you cool with this mechanical decision I've just pitched? Because not everybody
if it's me pitching it to you, you just go, yeah, that's dumb.
Yeah, well, maybe. But if you're not a person who sees statistics and numbers, and you don't see a D20 as 20 increments of 5%, or what does it mean to have an opposed roll with advantage, I have a heuristic for what those numbers mean.
Yeah.
and it's not, so, got to try and be fair and impartial as the GM and the judge for the table, and try and say yes.
Nice nod to DCC on the judge.
Hey, all right. I've also been reading John Peterson, so I'm living in two worlds right now. It's 19.
You're going to be the scholar on this show.
No, I am not, because I don't want the grognards atting me. So what about you? How I stole some of your thunder, and I apologize for that because
not at all.
I jumped first to I like the +3, -3. I don't usually use it, and I like it.
Yeah, so here's the thing. Here's how I would do it now with more, I think, experience and also just thinking about it in this moment. I just want to say for the record that I think both of us on a different day might come up with a different solution. In fact, I think we almost certainly would. Right now, what I would do is I would also say, okay, so you want to do this. You want to actually stab the guy with your sword and then throw him off. Okay, that's a lot, because not only is it going to take damage from your hit, but potentially from the fall. So let's do this. Let's say you have to hit in order to do this. So you're going to roll an attack. You don't get advantage on it. You have to hit. If you hit, then we'll roll an opposed grit check where you get advantage on the check. Great. However, I don't like that for two reasons. Number one, I don't like it because it creates another roll, right? Which I think ultimately my goal is always to resolve turns as quickly as possible. And number two, I don't like it because it's not as elegant as just clear his AC by 3 or 3 higher than it currently is, and then you can do this thing. Yours is great because you're going to toss him over, but you're not going to do damage on the hit, but he's going to take fall damage. But this is I don't want to end on this note, but I think that this is the thing that you're going to contend with as a GM. Because when a fighter asks, can I do something? And it's totally reasonable, you have to have an answer for either how it's going to work or why they can't do it. And in this case, I don't have a really great answer for why they wouldn't be able to do this. This is totally reasonable. You stab somebody with a sword and you try and throw them over, totally reasonable. How it gets done in Shadowdark is going to be different table to table and GM to GM. But I do think that in order to make fighters the most fun to play they possibly can be, you have to have an answer to questions like this.
I had a GM that used to get on us as players, and one of the things he would get frustrated about is he was really lavish with his descriptions, especially in combat. It was frankly one of his strengths as a GM is he would take whatever very simple thing you had done and he would turn it into this very dynamic narrative as combat was unrolling round by round. And it was really pretty neat. And it's something I've adopted a little bit of. He would get frustrated with us going like, hey, you guys, I get really tired of you going, I hit it with my sword. I hit it with my sword. I hit it with my sword. And the core of this conversation is you want to encourage your fighters to not just go, all right, I go ahead and I hit it with my sword. All right, I hit it with my sword. Or worse yet, and I've been watching this happen a little bit, and I'm not sure what the right answer is yet, of the person just, you go, okay, you're up next initiative, and they go, clunk, okay, I hit. And they don't say anything. All they do is just immediately throw their die and go, I hit, because they know what the AC is, that their target number is. And that's their turn. And it's like, wow, that's there's more here we could be doing.
yeah.
There's a lot more fun to be had. We are leaving fun on the table. That was the second one. I'm do that again. I have to leave.
Yeah, that's right. We shut down the show.
But I think core to this discussion is that interesting back and forth of you want turns to be quick and snappy, and you want your fighter to be encouraged to do the cool fightery thing, to be Errol Flynn, to be, as much as I groaned and mocked it, Legolas sliding down the shield stair nonsense, surfing the Oliphant. Is that a lot? Yeah. Is that kind of not really in keeping with the tone of Shadowdark? For me, it's not. But at your table, maybe it is. And you want your fighter within that world doing those sorts of things. I want my thief grabbing a handful of dirt and throwing it in a guy's face. I will give this as a final what if. What if you expanded luck tokens? What if luck tokens started getting out of their lane and doing some of these things? That's a topic for another day.
Yeah, Jody, wrap this thing up, because if you start with that, I have thoughts, and I don't think we're going to agree on
any of it.
No.
So I think suffice it to say, the fighter, though, kind of vanilla, maybe at top level. The place where you get some flavor and spice is these moments. And frankly, this whole conversation about doing something cool as a fighter and leveraging your grit in combat situations, talk with your player. That question that I've learned from Matt about, hey, is what you want to achieve knocking this dude off the stairs, or you want to stab him? I really want to get him off the stairs. Okay, well, then I'm going to make a call this way that it's going to reduce your damage a little bit, but you're going to get him off the stairs probably. Cool? Cool. Done. Let's go. Or, well, I really want to stab him, and then if I can, okay, well, then we either go into like a suggestion like Matt had where there's 2 sets of rolls, or I go, okay, this turn you're going to stab him, do your damage as normal. Next turn, we're going to make a separate check, and then you can throw them off because you want the stab and the throw them off, and you're trying to get 2 attacks worth of damage out of 1 round, and it's seeing that mechanical matrix a little bit, but that's a conversation away from the table you can have with that player and encourage them to do those things. Unlike the GM who I had who would chastise us at the table and made it not fun to be there, you can go, hey, I noticed you tried that cool thing in our last session. That was dope. I'd really love it for you to do more of that. Let's talk about what that looks like. Just be careful about turning them into writ scripts of then the person does that special thing every turn. There's got to be some give and take. So careful with that. But let's hear from our sponsors and we'll come back and have a little wrap up on this thing.
Adventurers, heroes, and questionably employed rogues. And you, Jody. Let me ask you something. Why is it easier to find a +2 longsword than a razor that doesn't cost a king's ransom? Now, Jody, you are a bearded fellow.
Yeah, for the winter seasons, I do like to insulate my face.
Now, Jody, when you decide to unbeard yourself, you're going to need some sort of implement, a razor perhaps, that is going to be able to cut through the coarse hairs that have sprouted from your chin and cheeks and that liminal space between the cheekbone and the sideburn.
Yeah, and, I'm going to be honest, it's pretty lush in there. It's, no little thin, dull dagger is going to do on this supple skin. I'm a little worried, man. I've had chafing issues in the past.
Well, let me introduce you to Gold Piece Shave Club, where you can get a premium set of shaving gear that actually fits your budget because we're public school teachers. So this doesn't require you to have a dragon's hoard. Here's the deal. Once a month, a perfectly packaged box arrives at your doorstep, filled with a top-notch razor, blades, shaving cream, and a brush made from the hairs of a kobold. It's got everything you need to stay sharp, minus the gimmicks or those ridiculous multi-blade contraptions you see elsewhere. Now, I know what y'all are thinking. What about that good old-fashioned, highly polished, and sharpened dagger, Jody? That's what you were using before, right?
Yeah, the chafing. Oh, God, the chafing.
Well, you can throw that thing in the trash. You don't need to use those old-fashioned, cheap, disposable blades. No. Use the new-fashioned, cheap, disposable blades. When you're ready to move past having hair like a bugbear, you can get yourself a subscription to Gold Piece Shave Club. Just use the code SMOOTHROLL at checkout to get 10% off your first order. That's right, the Gold Piece Shave Club, because sure, there are cheaper ways, but where's the fun in that?
All right, friends, let's bring this topic to the light and see what we can take away from our fighters. All their loot, that's what we can take away. Matt, kick us off here.
Yeah, so my first one is, I think it's actually not a bad idea to let the fighter reveal themselves. I don't know if maybe your group, listener, is going to gravitate toward the fighter or not, but I actually like the organic way that fighters were revealed as second characters, as the spiteful fighters, because it really is when you have experience with the game and the game mechanics that they actually end up being very clearly exceptional at what they are supposed to do, not just for players, but also for GMs.
Absolutely. I'm going to take it back to the top of our discussion around weapon mastery. As a GM, diversify the horde. Matt and I are learning to more and more and more random on those treasure tables. let them get that golf bag full of maces and hand axes and goofy daggers, and they got the hauler ability. They can truck them around. It can be really fun to give them a wide variety of tools that don't necessarily align with their already exceptional abilities. Because I assure you, at higher levels, they will feel exceptional already, even without a +2 avenging flaming sword of, oh my God. That's mine.
Yeah, so my next one is actually kind of what we ended our discussion with, which is that you got to have an answer for the can I do this cool thing, or how could I do this cool thing? You and I, we talked about specifically an example that came out of the DCC rulebook, and I think that actually it would be worth going and just grabbing the DCC rulebook and reading through the heroic or mighty deeds list just to get a sense of the kinds of things that you might want to have a mechanical way to adjudicate, at least something in the back of your head, just so you're not surprised. Just, it doesn't have to be the same thing every time, but just so that you as a GM aren't caught off guard not having an answer to a totally reasonable player question.
And I think there's a lot of validity to just echo that one of having a different answer every time as a GM, because each situation might be different. All right, I'm going to close this out here. GMs, leverage the fighter's lack of soft skills. They probably dump statted their intelligence, wisdom, and or charisma. The fighters excel in combat, not smooth chat. Well, unless they do, because they have a high charisma. But take advantage of the fact that they aren't good at everything. When the fighter role plays and is having that chat with the barmaid, remember that they're a dirty, dirty fighter. All right, folks, that was my third one, so we got to wrap up here. As the torchlight grows dim, we hope you were able to find something useful in our discussion that you can take into a future game. If you have any questions or unique experience from your table that you'd like us to discuss in a future episode, head on over to the Dungeon Master Diaries thread on the Shadow Dark Discord channel. Look for links to any materials we referenced in this episode in that thread or in the show notes. If you'd like to reach out to us directly, you can find Jody on the Shadow Dark Facebook page under the handle Esman, and you can reach Matt via Discord using the handle SCMatt. Until next time, keep fighting.
Dungeon Master Diaries is a production of the Stingbat Radio Network. It is produced by Jody Kropholler and edited by Matt Bruner. Our intro and outro music is composed by Christian Schuster. Dungeon Master Diaries is an independent production and is not affiliated with the Arcane Library, LLC. Shadow Dark RPG is a product of Arcane Library. Copyright 2023.